Good morning again. My name is Dana Knowles. I am Vice President of Grow Business here at the Greater Tallahassee Chamber of Commerce. Today is the first of four sessions, and I realize that my slide, now that I'm actually talking to you guys, says real estate update at the top. That is not what we're doing today. You will see that's what happens when you have multiple events in 1 week. So I will acknowledge my my error there. But anyways, today is the first of four sessions in our business recovery series. So every other week for the next 8 weeks, we are hosting a topic for you guys. Today we kick off with human resources and employment law with Bill Krisner, and we will follow that up with finance and accounting, marketing communications, and end on strategic planning. So we hope that this will help you guys learn and close out 2020 and get ready for what I like to say will be hopefully an epic 2021 for everyone. So we are proud today as well to have sponsors, Leon Cares and the CARES Act dollars helping to bring this to you today, as well as Capital Health Plan. So we have our two sponsors and we greatly appreciate their support. Two quick housekeeping items, and then I will turn it over. Again, we are recording, so we'll send this out to everyone, and it'll live on our chamber YouTube page when we're done. And if you have questions as we go along, please pop them in the Q&A portal, and Bill and I will both be checking in on those and get those to you as we move forward. So Bill, if you want, you can pop me out and share your screen. And I am going to turn it over to Bill Krisner with the Krisner Group for today's presentation.
Well, what a year. What a year it has been, friends. It is great to be with you, and I'm grateful to the Chamber for the opportunity to come and speak to the membership. And yes, you don't want any advice on real estate from me, but I'm here to talk to you about HR and employment law, and we're going to do our very best today to cover a lot of content in a relatively short period. As we go, by the way, I will be looking over to my Q&A box to see if anybody who's with us live has any questions that they'd like me to address. We're going to just kind of do some quick hitters, if you will, because the pandemic has hit us all in so many different ways, and that includes our workplace. It includes our employees. And dealing and navigating through that has been a challenge, to be frank with you, as an employment lawyer this year. In large part because, well, one, we've never had a pandemic like this before. But two, there were a lot of laws. There's been a lot of new laws and a lot of new guidance that has been issued by the federal government in particular, without a lot of interpretation initially. And so we've been doing our very best to kind of stay current and communicate that to our client base to make sure they're aware of the do's and don'ts in the workplace as we proceed forward. So again, without further ado, you should see on your screen a document, very simple one, entitled A Torch in the Darkness. And the idea here again is we're going to talk about different topics that impact your employees, and in particular steps, practical steps that you should be pursuing to mitigate against risk. And I will start by saying that as well, which is I think everyone on the line understands that plaintiffs' lawyers work generally on contingency basis, meaning that they get paid when they win. And the pandemic really hit them hard because, for the 3-4 months when people really didn't want to be around anyone else, no one was walking in or going to see the plaintiff's attorneys, right? And so that's caused some problems. They're not making money like they used to. And so now what you're seeing is they're catching up very quickly. They're filing a record amount of litigation, particularly involving matters associated with the pandemic. So as a business community, right, we have to be prepared and ready for that onslaught of litigation. So the first point here says, whistleblower warning, importance of investigations and statements. And so I think, again, most of you have been through some of my webinars, my trainings in the past, but when you get ready to discipline an employee, to correct an employee, and certainly when you get ready to terminate an employee, oftentimes you reach out to your employment attorney, right, your HR attorney. And what happens is when you call me and you say, hey, Bill, we want to get rid of Jane. What I'll do is I'll ask you a series of questions, and they're usually related to the protected class of Jane. For those of you who are not familiar with that phrase, protected class, that simply means a human trait or characteristic that has historically been oppressed or discriminated against in some way, A law has been passed since that time that makes it illegal to act because of one of those classes. And so, normally we're talking about things like race and gender and age, those type of topics. And, if it's somebody who is in a minority race at an elevated age that has a significant disability, it doesn't mean that you're not going to proceed with a corrective action or potentially terminating the employee. But it does mean that there's a much higher risk or much higher probability that that individual is going to find plaintiff's counsel to file a case, oftentimes a frivolous one, but a case nonetheless. And so, again, that simply puts a heavier emphasis on the need for documentation. Some of you are saying, yeah, Bill, we know that. We've been to your trainings before. What's new? Well, what's new is that when I ask those series of questions of you, the one that I usually don't think to ask is, has the individual complained about some type of violation of local, state, or federal law? In other words, have they, quote, blown the whistle on something they believe to be illegal? And the reason being is that, frankly, that's very rarely the case. However, we are in a different kind of year, aren't we? We're in the year of the pandemic. And so now what we have is we have a lot of our employees that are continuously anxious and worried and concerned about the safety of the workplace. And so you have a lot of people, at least I've seen a lot of different people through my clients raising issues associated with the way that masks are being worn or not being worn. Social distancing, cleaning, a lot of other topics that we'll get into as we proceed today. So when the individual brings that up, right, the problem is that if we then do a corrective action the next week or we fire them the next month, they very well may try to file a frivolous claim of action saying, I complained about an OSHA violation in the private sector, right? And once I complained, something bad happened to me, right? There was retaliation, there was a whistleblower. That's a real issue for us. And so I guess the two practical points here are, number one, that when you're talking to your employment attorney, you're talking to me, make sure you bring that up, right? And I've been asking my clients this because it does inform our risk assessment and what we're going to recommend. But number two, the other point here is also very important, is that when people are making these complaints or raising these concerns, don't kind of roll your eyes and go, come on, right? Like, we've already addressed that. This is ridiculous, and ignore it. In fact, what I want you to do is, quote unquote, an investigation, meaning look into the fact that, Jane is upset that Joe is wearing his mask here rather than here, right? And that's a very common one. And when you do, right, you address it. If Joe's not doing what he's supposed to do, you talk to Joe, you do a little performance plan on Joe and say, start wearing it the right way. But then we document the fact that we did, again, not only investigate, but we took prompt remedial action. We did something to make sure that behavior or that safety concern has been addressed. So I think that's really important this year, much more so than in years gone by. And it's something, again, a lot of our clients really haven't thought deeply about before, and I want to make sure you're aware of it. So number two, the remote work challenge. Okay, so our clients, and I think the chamber members generally, right, locally, are in all different stages. We have people that the folks went home and they're still working 100% from home. We have clients that have completely migrated back. We have clients that never left. And we have clients that are kind of, some are home and some are at the office, right? And so one of the areas, again, that's kind of been lost in the proverbial shuffle here is wage and hour, okay? And so, again, most of you, I know some of this is review, but most of you understand that there are exempt employees and non-exempt employees, okay? And you should be very clear as an employer which of your folks, which of your positions can be exempted from what's called the Fair Labor Standard Act, right? Meaning that those exempt individuals don't have to be paid overtime. They don't have to keep time records. And those individuals are perfectly fine. We're not talking about the exempt people, but your non-exempt people, those individuals, right, that are what we call overtime eligible, those individuals right now are in different stages as well. And so when they're working from home, there are some things that we've forgotten about. And one example of that is, before the pandemic, if non-exempt Ned, right, got up and had his breakfast, got into his car, and he commuted to work, you as the employer wouldn't pay for that commute time to the office. And then when non-exempt Ned finished his day and, clocked out and got into his car and drove home, you wouldn't pay for the commute time home either. But now, if non-exempt Ned is actually working from his physical house, that changes his primary work site. And so now when non-exempt Ned has to run from his house over to your office to pick something up and come back, that travel time to and from actually has to be paid, right? That's compensable commute time. So we want to make sure that that is indeed showing up on non-exempt Ned's time record. The other maybe even bigger problem we have is that when you work from home, everything becomes fluid, okay? And so non-exempt Ned is, during the day, he's working, quote unquote, but then, gosh, the dogs need let out and it's a beautiful day. And so he sits out on the porch and enjoys it a little bit. And then in non-exempt Ned's head, right, he thinks, well, but I know tonight that I'll pull up my laptop when I'm laying in bed, streaming Netflix, and I'll catch up on my emails, et cetera. And what we found is that a lot of the non-exempt Neds aren't really keeping a detailed account of the amount of hours that they're working. And oftentimes the non-exempt Neds are, quote unquote, working more hours than are showing up on the time record. And so those of you who simply put 888, or 8 to 5, 8 to 5, 8 to 5, a lot of times that becomes very problematic once we have a Department of Labor audit or review. So I just want to ring that bell. Unfortunately, wage and hour stuff is not very sexy. It doesn't get a lot of time or attention in most organizations, but it's one of the first things that we do when we do an audit of our clients. Is that, the first time somebody hires us to come in, the very first thing we're going to do is review your wage and hour compliance, and we're going to try to show the exemptions that are appropriate, but then a lot of times we're exempting people that shouldn't be exempt. It's an area of importance always, but I would say it's important this year in particular. Okay. Just looking over, I don't see any questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to continue forward then. Number 3, but the school gives us the choice. Paid leave as school returns. Okay, so I think again, we've all lived this year, so but in the spring, what happened is when the pandemic really started sort of exploding, is that some of the schools, many of the schools, decided to close down. Okay, and what happened was that the federal government passed a series of laws, one of them being a law called the EFMLA. And what that law said is that if an employee was a parent and that employee parent had a student whose school was closed, that employee parent was entitled to receive 2/3 of his or her pay and didn't have to work. In other words, could just stay at the house with kids. And that was a problem for a lot of our employers. And so what we did is we negotiated with those employees. And we said, hey, we understand you could stay home and collect 2/3 pay, but we really need you, and we're happy to have you at the house, and we'll pay you 100%, but we need you to work while you're at the house. And the law allowed us to kind of negotiate that from an employer perspective, and that worked out. And probably, 9 out of 10 times that was the result. So then the summer came, and the schools, both public and independent, had time to sort of work through all this and come up with their own game plan, if you will, for the start of the fall semester. And so almost every school locally, not all, but almost every school locally reopened, and they gave an option, right? It was a hybrid. In other words, we have a brick and mortar option, so you can send your kids here like always, or if you're not comfortable with that, you can have your kids stay at home and we'll provide a virtual format, right? You can do remote learning. And so a lot of parents actually decided, I don't want to send my kids back to school. I'm too concerned. I'm worried about it. And by the way, I think I'm going to go ahead and claim that EFMLA. So I just want to take my 2/3 pay for up to 12 weeks. Well, the law was clarified before school began to say that actually, if the school offers a brick and mortar option, you're not eligible for the EFMLA, okay? In other words, we respect your decision to go ahead and keep your kids at home, but you're not going to be able to receive the federal subsidy. So that's an important note that we need to be aware of, because again, things kind of go up and down. You never quite know where we're going to end up. We do have 2 local schools that reopened and now have completely closed and offer only virtual. And so many of those parents were impacted when that happened and went in and were able to claim or use the EFMLA. If you're a small business, you have under 50 employees, particularly if you're a much, much smaller business, say 10 or 15, there is an exemption that you can claim to avoid being covered by that particular law. So I won't bore you with all of that right now, but if you want to explore that, as always, reach out and I'm happy to explain it to you in more detail. Again, it's no Q&A. That's good. I guess it's good. But if you have things you're thinking about as I touch on these subjects, feel free to pop them in there and we'll make sure we address them. Number 4, return to the physical work site. Not so fast, the ADA and FMLA still must be considered. So what are we talking about here? Well, again, as I mentioned, many of us had employees that went and work remotely. In fact, we probably required them to go and work remotely. Maybe you still do. But as we began to sort of return, we migrated back to the workspace. What we found is we had a lot of our clients with a couple employees that would say, not ready. And the employer would say, oh, are you suffering from COVID-related symptoms, right? And therefore qualified under the FFCRA. No. Have you been in immediate contact with somebody that has is suffering from these kind of symptoms? No. Is your child's school closed? No. Well, we need you to come back. I'm just not ready. Well, we need you, right? Like our customers, our clients, our patients, we have to have you back. Just can't do it. And then some of the folks were very creative. They said, I'm too anxious. And they went and got a psychiatrist to create a medical note saying that they suffered from clinical anxiety. And therefore, it was a request for a reasonable accommodation under the ADA. And some of the employers, well, this is ridiculous, I'm just going to fire them. Not so fast, okay? We have to work through the traditional ADA framework. And I think most of you are familiar with it. But that framework says, can the person with the disability perform the essential functions of the job with or without reasonable accommodation? And so here you presume the person does have, even if you disagree, but you go ahead and say, okay, you have clinical anxiety, right? The essential function of the job is we have to serve our customers, our patients, et cetera. Your request for reasonable accommodation is this unpaid leave, right, of some period of time. Unfortunately, it creates an undue hardship to our business because without you, you fill a vital role. Essential functions is this in-person interaction. We're going to deny that request under the ADA, and you'll need to return to work or be separated. So you see the result is the same. We end up with the same result. We separate the individual, but we use the legal framework that's necessary so that if Marie Maddox files a lawsuit against us, right, we're able to say, no. We knew our stuff. We knew what we were doing, but unfortunately, there was just no way to accommodate. It's a big difference between just that we're not going to do it versus having the right documentation showing that we played by those proverbial rules. So just want to tell you all, and it's true not only from that now, I guess, kind of traditional sort of like moving from home back to work, but sometimes you're going to have an employee who just, becomes anxious. They're around somebody, they're reading too many news stories, whatever it is. And, they've been back to work for 3 weeks or 2 months. And now suddenly they say, I need to go home. Going to use the same framework, the same concept. And, again, if you need help, reach out to me and we'll kind of walk you through it. I see that we've got a couple questions. Thank you, Alva and John. The first question says, can you speak to requiring some people to work in the office and others able to work remote? Yes, we will. I'm going to footnote that one, Alva, and I promise that we will get to that. That's going to come up here when we get to the second page. And John asks, can you put them on furlough until they return? Yes. In other words, furlough meaning that I'm going to use somebody else to be able to potentially do this job. But remember that they're still going to be in the setting we talked about, and I presume John's referring back to the school issue, that individual is going to be protected. Their job is going to be protected. So they're going to get that 2/3 pay. They're going to be gone for up to 12 weeks. But when they're ready to return, you have to allow their return to that same position, that same job. So you can use the word or phrase furlough if you want. But the reality is they're still your employee and they still have that same right to return. So I hope that answers the question. And Alba, I promise we will get to yours. Thank you, though. And again, keep those questions coming because we're about to get into a very substantive area that I think is going to create some concern and probably some follow-up questions on it. But before we do, let me just go back to one more reminder, and this is number 5. So one of the things that we work very hard to teach our clients is how important the interview assessment process is. Some of you are familiar with this, some of you are not. This simply refers to the fact that when you get to the interview stage and you have 2 or more candidates you're considering for a job, it is really important that you write down what you like and what you don't like about each of those candidates, okay? There's old formats where there was here are the 10 questions I ask every candidate. That doesn't help us at all. I think it just gives you hand cramps. What I really want to see is I want you to write down what an interview candidate does well in the interview and what they don't do well, enough to distinguish why you hired one over the other. Okay, and again, I could do an hour presentation just on that. But the reason that I want to remind you of this is because if you haven't realized, we're in a recession right now. Back in spring, when I did the last chamber presentation, it was really, really scary. I mean, our unemployment was 17, neighboring 18%. We looked like we were headed towards the next Great Depression. Fortunately, we're a strong economy, both locally and nationally, and we bounce back, right? Like we always do. We're resilient as a country. But our unemployment rate, while it's dropped now under 10%, is still double or arguably 2.5 times as high as it was a year ago, okay? And that's bad. That means that, again, a lot of people are without jobs. And what happened is that $600 a week subsidy the federal government was giving is gone. And so now you have a lot of individuals that are very hungry for jobs. And when they can't find jobs, I mean, just to be very real world with you, they're not afraid to file lawsuits. And a very popular one that we see every time we've had a recession, back in 2009 when the housing bust happened, we saw it locally. And that's failure to hire litigation. I applied for the job. I was interviewed. I didn't get the job. I think it was because of my age. And I turn around, I get a Marie Maddox, I get one of these plaintiffs firms, and I file the lawsuit. And then it comes to us, right, as the employment law firm here locally, and I say, okay, where's the interview assessment forms? And you go, the what? And I say, the forms you fill out saying why the person you hired, the younger person, was better for the job. Because on paper, it looks like the older person should have gotten the job. No. The older person was late and had body odor and just couldn't put 2 words. Look, I hear you. But if I don't have that in documentation, we're in a bad position. So if you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, I really want to urge you all to start doing that now. This would be the time to do it. And if you want to see a sample interview assessment form, simply reach out to me or to our firm, and we can show you what that looks like. For those of you who are doing them, keep doing them. After you come to this seminar today, go back and remind every one of your supervisors how important it is to do that documentation. Okay. All right. So closing in here about 9 o'clock, this is right about where I wanted to be. 6, 7, and 8, okay? I'm going to give you a foundation for these 3 because this is the most important thing that I'm going to say to you today, okay? And this is, frankly, the time when we're talking about a topic that could end your business. So I'm going to give you just a little historical reference. There was a time, most of you are old enough to remember asbestos, right? And the idea that buildings were built with asbestos, not knowing that it was a dangerous substance that made people very sick or arguably killed them. And so, employees would get sick in buildings that had asbestos. And generally, they were inclined to be able to be eligible for workers' comp because, the employer didn't really know about it. They got sick. It was terrible once they discovered it was a bad thing. And there was insurance, right? There was a way to be able to help those individuals that had become ill. But then you also eventually had workplaces after asbestos was known to be a terrible substance that continued to house people in those buildings, right? They almost, quote unquote, intentionally subjected their employees to this dangerous substance. Then there was a whole nother kind of lawsuit, right? Negligence and intentional torts that was being filed, where workers' comp was not going to provide the insurance. In fact, these employers had no insurance coverage for those kind of claims. That was really, really bad for those employers. What in the world does asbestos have to do with the pandemic? Well, in large part, everything. Because now I mentioned those plaintiffs' lawyers that sort of shut down for 3 months with no money. What you're seeing at a national level is a lot of firms that are now starting to file these negligent type cases against employers because the employers are failing to provide safe working terms or working environment in the midst of a pandemic. And so what I'm really saying is this, is that there is this brand new sort of pandemic standard of care that has quickly developed over the past months. And, I'm a plain Jane kind of guy. I grew up in Pittsburgh, right? I don't try to do fancy statutes and case sites and PowerPoints and all that. I just talk to you in plain terms. And the plain terms is this, which is we have to, right? As an individual workplace, we have to stay inside the herd, okay? Meaning we have to do what others are doing, what we're told to do. If, when it comes to the pandemic, we get in front of the herd, we will get trampled, right? Meaning we are going to assume way too much risk and we will be the workplace that gets sued for this negligence theory, arguably with no insurance to be able to protect your assets. So how do we decide the herd, the standard of care, if you will? Well, there are at least 3 different places to look. The first one is, what are local workplaces doing, right? What are the greater Tallahassee employees or employers doing when it comes to things like masks and social distancing and whether they are or they're not at the office and cleaning and all kinds of other things, right? Being in the know, being part of an organization like the Chamber has a lot of value, particularly in a pandemic, because you get the chance to talk to others and sort of get a sense of what's going on locally. Second thing is your industry, right? What are my industry counterparts doing, not just locally, not just regionally, but at a statewide and arguably even a regional or a national basis? So making sure, again, and most of you are industries and probably part of industry groups where these conversations are happening, right? Probably your HR professionals, if you have one, or if you're just a small business owner, you're probably attending some of these seminars to know what's going on out there. But we want to do the same kind of things that they're doing. And then the third, and arguably the most important influence when it comes to standard of care or the herd, right, is what does the Queen Mother tell us that we should be doing? And right now, this year, the Queen Mother is the CDC. And so when the CDC speaks, we listen, right? Every word that comes out of their mouth matters greatly to us. And so we're constantly, that's part of my job, right? I didn't think I was going to be a doctor. I signed up to be a lawyer. But we read everything that they publish because it influences how we are advising our clients. So understanding that background, the sort of standard of care, the herd, right, is the most important thing right now. So with that in mind, I want to look at 6, 7, and 8 and give you some sense of where things are with each of them. The first issue here says exposure without a positive test, what to do. Okay. So many of you have had this happen to you, right? So you have an individual, your employee, and he or she calls you and says, well, it happened. I went to a party on Saturday and I was around this lady whose cousin over in Alabama's neighbor's daughter tested positive. And so I think I need to stay out for 14 days. The answer is no, that's not going to work, right? That's not what the CDC or anybody's looking at right now. Not that kind of like 5 removed exposure. If so, none of us should even try to work anymore. We should just shut down the economy. So what we're looking for, right, are situations where there's immediate and intimate extended sort of contact, if you will. So, the 15 minutes, within 5 feet, I mean, all these different terms, right, that are out there. So generally, what I tell clients is if your employee says, my wife, my husband, my boyfriend, my girlfriend, my child, my parent, if I live with a parent, somebody I live with has a positive test, clearly you don't want them into your office until there's a negative test, right? But when it comes to, gee, I've been around somebody who's been around somebody, that's not expected. That's not sort of within that herd concept that, gee, now you've got to let them stay out for 14 days. That's not where we are. So that's the good news that I'll share with you, right? We have to be smart about it. Clearly, even in some of these critical industries, the CDC said, hey, even if they've had this kind of contact, if they come back with a mask, on, we can kind of live with that. So they're pretty giving in terms of that side of the equation. Talking about masks, number 7, the most controversial word in the English language. I don't know how in the world we've gotten to that place, but that's where we are, okay? And so I'm not here to be political and try to convince you of one thing or another. Look, whatever people want to do when they're not at work is not my concern, okay? I'm an employment lawyer. And so my job and what clients pay me to do is to advise them on how to mitigate and lessen risk. And so with that in mind, where we are when it comes to the standard of care in the workplace is this. If you have people back in the building, okay, if that employee is in a private space, I mean private, it's a locked office, it's a cubicle with probably 10 feet from anybody else, it's okay for that individual not to have the mask on. But when that individual walks down the hall, right, goes into the break room, goes to the bathroom, whatever it is, they must be wearing the mask, and they must be wearing the mask properly. It can't be here, it has to be here, okay? When we're having meetings, and again, some of my clients aren't liking me right now, but again, remember, I get paid to tell you the truth. When we're having meetings, you should be wearing a mask. Now, some people say, well, what if we have a monster, conference room and, we're 10 feet away from each other? I said, well, you know what? That may be right on the fringe of the herd. But if you really need to have that mask off and be 10 feet away in opposite corners of a large conference room, that's probably fine as well. What we're seeing more of is that people are back in the physical work site, and when they're having their meetings and interactions, it's kind of bizarro, right? But then they do this. They just do the Zoom thing, or they do the Teams thing. And they're still in their office, they're still in the workspace, et cetera. So again, there's all different ways to kind of handle and address this. But it is really important for me to say to you again, that if they are in your physical office, right, and they are around anyone else, or they're walking through a common area or common space, they should be wearing masks appropriately, okay? And then number 8, so this has been a bouncing ball, returning after a positive test. So probably nearly all of you now have had an employee, probably multiple employees, that have tested positive for COVID. So what we were doing early in the pandemic is there was a sort of just simple kind of rule, which was, hey, if somebody's COVID positive, they have to stay out for 14 days. They have to give us 2 negative tests, then they can come back to work. Well, there were all kinds of problems happening with the testing concept. Everything from early on, if you remember, people were standing in these long lines with other people who thought they had COVID. If they didn't, they probably got COVID from standing in lines. To, the test results were coming back, but they were coming back by telephone, and we couldn't get anything in writing. And so the CDC recognized a lot of problems with the test. So they said, we want to move away from what we call test-based return to work and move towards symptom-based return. And in late August, they issued a new guidance, right? Sort of talking to this. And basically they said, if you have an employee that tests positive, but they're asymptomatic, meaning they don't have any symptoms, or it's very, very mild, right? That individual only needs to stay out of work for 10 days, and then they can come back, okay? However, if they have severe symptoms, obviously if they're hospitalized, if they have an extended fever for a long period of time, they're sick, we want them to stay out for 20 days, and then they can come back to work. So you see this sort of distinction with no reference to requiring any kind of testing. Now, inside the guidance, it did say, this is not to say that employers are not allowed or it's illegal to consult or get a doctor's release to come back to work, which presumably also meant testing. So it's not that it's illegal, but the standard has changed now, moving more towards the symptom-based consideration than the test-based one. So I want to encourage y'all to be mindful of that, to stay current with what the CD is saying, and doing it that way probably puts you in the center of the herd where we want to be. So I don't see any questions under the Q&A regarding standard of care or herd, but that is a really important piece for everybody to hear out there, because that's the big lawsuit, the one that keeps Bill Krisner up at night, is that one, where we're going to end up getting sued, and there's going to be depositions taken, and people are going to be honest and admit that in your workplace, people didn't wear masks, or they only wore masks sometimes, and that's why Johnny got sick and Johnny died. Like, that's going to be an absolute nightmare. I see Lisa says, Can we require a second test for employees if industry is daycare? Yes. In other words, as I just mentioned, the CDC is not, at least so far, saying that you're not allowed to require the test. So if that's what you want, and that's where you're kind of brought to, then yes, you could still require and ask for the test. Okay, good. All right. Lightening it up a little bit. This has been a hard year, y'all, right? Number 9, setting Zoom and video conference expectations. So again, most of you, whether you liked it or you didn't, you found yourself now using these different virtual platforms, communication tools like Zoom, like Teams, some of these others. And so these are just a couple practical tips because as you can tell, our firm has been doing all of our audits, all of our trainings, all of our internal meetings, everything has been done via Zoom. And so here's a couple little things. One is when you do a meeting on Zoom, go ahead and tell people tell people in advance that they are not allowed to black screen. Okay, and that's a funny thing, but if you allow people just to go ahead and black screen you, it will be terribly disruptive. I've done trainings where there'll be 50 screens, these little Zoom screens all over, and every single one is a black screen. And there I am trying to talk about whatever, sexual harassment and discrimination, blah, blah, blah. And it is really hard, I got to tell you, to talk to a screen. Because in my mind, I'm thinking, yeah, Jane is probably out in the back watering her flowers in the garden, right? Bob went down to get a cheeseburger. He'll be back before the thing's over. It's really tough. And it's hard to imagine that it's sufficiently, engaging. So we really ask our clients have people be live when we do our training sessions. I would do the same when it comes to meetings. In fact, in meetings sometimes, as kindergarten as it is, I'll have, a one contact or one contribution rule where, if we're going to have a half-hour meeting, everybody agrees in advance that there's going to be at least, one contribution that you'll make, one question, one comment, whatever else it is. I know that sounds really silly, but I'm telling you, when you're at home or even when you're in your little private office, it is so hard to stay focused because it's 2020. That's kind of it. The other one is that when you are doing Zooms, the Zoom meetings and whatnot, it is really important to make sure that anybody in your house, your office, wherever you might be, everybody knows that you're on a training session. So this morning before I'm at the house right now, if I made sure that I told my wife, two of my daughters are off school today. I told them, I made sure the dogs are outside. Like, I do not want you to be distracted by, my surroundings. So here's the funny story that I've been telling everybody. It's hard to imagine, but it's true. So I was doing, of all things, a sexual harassment training. And there was a woman who's, I don't know how the Zoom prioritizes, but the screen next to mine, the little grid next to mine, the whole time, all I could see was her face. She was like in this dark room. It was just like the glow of the laptop, right, that was illuminating her. And then all of a sudden, as I was talking about quid pro quo, this for that, this light from behind her opens up. And what it is it's a door, and her husband walks out of the bathroom, and he is buck naked, y'all. I mean, like, toweling his head off. It's the full Monty. No idea that he's being streamed to 50 other people. And I mean, I'm this is what I do for a living, so it's hard to kind of get me off track when I'm speaking. And I went back to watch it, and I went, and I froze. And everybody started laughing. It was a terrible moment. She didn't get in trouble, and it wasn't a corrective action or anything. But it was a really vivid reminder, very vivid reminder, that you want to be sure everyone in the house knows. Okay, so just a couple little practical things there on that front. Phyllis says, do we continue to pay the employee while out on the newly based criteria? Yes, Phyllis. So you would pay the first 2 weeks of the time that the individual is out with COVID, and you'll get all of that money back through the FFCRA, through your payroll tax. Your accountant should be able to help you recover all those monies. And then there's another question that says, on the black screen, what if there's only way is because the computer doesn't have a camera? Yeah, and that's, unfortunately, sometimes that is true. I've found, though, that, and I'm not a techie guy, more times than not, it's a user error. because, you know, if you have a really old laptop, maybe you don't, maybe there's not a camera on it, but phones, almost everybody has a phone, a smartphone that has that ability. So I just say push a little bit harder when people say, oh, I'm sorry, I can't because my computer doesn't have it. Ask them what kind of phone they have, and is there any reason they can't dial in and put you on FaceTime that way? I don't know. Maybe it's just a pet peeve of mine. I just think that in terms of having sufficient engagement, you really do want that. 10, sick pools and PTO sharing. Still not a good idea, but if you must. So, you know, look, there's some people who are being really sick. I mean, you know, we had a dear friend of ours die recently. And so this pandemic is the real deal. So when one of your employees gets really sick and is hospitalized and they're out for weeks, you know, maybe even into months, you have good folks that work for you, and they come forward and they say, hey, I want to give my sick time. I want to give my PTO time, you know, to help Bill since he's now in an unpaid spot. And I've never been a fan of those things. We've had lawsuits, in fact, historically, because what it does is it creates, you know, cultural divide, morale issues, if you will. But it also can look discriminatory. You know, why'd you do it for Joe, not for Jane? I know we're in a pandemic, and so what I've told my clients who've asked about it is I said, okay, well, listen, if you really must, right, here's the thing. Don't let supervisors take part. So if Frontline Fred wants to give it, you know, to Frontline Flynn, right, that's fine. I mean, I don't love it, but that's okay. What I don't want is Supervisor Sam to give his or her time, because Supervisor Sam is an extension of the organization, right? It's as though the company is sort of discriminating and doing for one and not for another. So be real careful with that anytime, but particularly in the pandemic. 11, big news not involving COVID. I tell my clients, if you want to get a quicker response in the Ray line, put a non-COVID question. And that'll be the first one that I choose to answer when I pull up my email. Because you know, 99% of the questions this year have been in this world. But there was a big Supreme Court case that came out, a surprise one, because you know it's a very conservative federal Supreme Court right now. But they came out and found that sexual orientation is actually a protected class under the word gender back in Title VII. And so in Leon County, we've had sexual orientation and gender identity as protected classes for more than a decade now. But why that matters is when there's a big splash decision, a decision that now impacts every county, city, town in America, the plaintiffs' lawyers tend to file more of those kind of suits, right? And so locally, I haven't seen it yet, but I fully expect that Marie and the gang will be filing more of the LGBTQ type actions. And so a very simple thing, but you know, start by going back and looking in your handbook and making sure that both your grooming and your dress policies are gender neutral. You can't say, you know, women can only have 1/4-inch nails anymore. You can say employees can have no more than a 1/4-inch nail, but there should be no gender distinction within those policies, just as an example. 12, what about your facilities, the bathrooms, elevators, and the like? So my younger brother, Jeff, works in, he's a managing partner of a big public accounting firm up in Atlanta, and his commute from Marietta is 35 or 40 minutes normally. But now he teasingly told me the other day he has a 35-minute commute to downtown, and then he has another 30-minute what they call elevator commute, which means that, you know, when you work on one of the high floors, it usually 20 to 30 people get on these elevators, you know, and go up. Well, now only 4 can get on at a time. So it adds another half hour to the commute time, both to and from work. Thank God we live in Tallahassee, right? That's all I can say. But why do I say that to you? Well, make sure, in particular, your bathrooms. There was a study, a very comprehensive study that came out that validated that COVID does linger in the air. And so while, you know, most cases of COVID really do stem from sort of breathing, being, you know, too close to somebody who has it, now it has been validated and verified that you can walk into an empty room and, quote, catch COVID in that room, right? So why do I bring that up? Well, I bring that up because when it comes to something like the bathroom, which is usually a very intimate, small area, we need to be sure that we're cleaning them at a much higher and greater rate than we used to. And I do think back to the herd, that's an important piece. We need to be sure that we can show that we're spending more time and more effort and more money on cleaning our facilities generally than we did a year before. So just another little reminder on that. 13, and this kind of gets to Phyllis's question at some level as well. So, I've been talking about all these different laws. The one that I've kind of skimmed over, but is sort of the core one, and that is that if an employee even suffers from COVID-like symptoms, right, sore throat, cold, whatever it is, they have the ability to stay out of work and receive full pay. You, the employer, are able to sort of recover that full amount, but they can stay out for 2 weeks. So here's the rub, and this is probably where Phyllis was going, and that is the idea that, hey, I just got done saying the CDC wants somebody who is sick, severely sick, to stay out for 20 days, but yet the FFCRA is only going to pay for 2 weeks. So what happens with that third week, that gap? Well, the answer is that it needs to come out of that employee's sick or PTO balance. And you can legally charge them or require them to use that time. So it may not feel patently fair, and some of my clients that are in good financial positions, some are, some aren't right now because of the economy, they may choose to just sort of say, well, we're going to pay them anyway. It's no fault of their own, it's a pandemic. But many of my clients don't have money trees in the backyard, right? So they have to charge the normal sick or PTO time. And if they don't have sick or PTO, then at that point, of course, you could require that they use unpaid leave. Okay. 14, COVID pregnancy discrimination suits are on the rise. So the EEOC, actually, the federal government itself, has been filing some of these cases currently. What you need to be reminded of is that if you have a woman that's pregnant and she has concerns, safety concerns about being at the office because of her unborn child or the like, that we have to consider that pregnancy the same as a disability. So I refer you back to an earlier conversation about unpaid leave, about the idea of a reasonable accommodation, undue hardship, all of those kind of words, really important to make sure we walk through that framework. So just because a pregnant employee doesn't want to come to the office doesn't mean that you have to grant it. But if you deny it, you have to show that there would be an undue hardship for her not to be granted that request. And so knowing that the feds are filing those cases, again, oftentimes local plaintiffs' attorneys do the same thing. And Stephen chimes in, and this is a very common question. Is it just the employee's word that they have COVID-like symptoms get the FFCRA leave? Yeah, it is. They're supposed to, go and seek medical attention, go see a doctor, et cetera. But in short, the answer is yes. If they tell you that they're not feeling well and they're going for a test, then, and you can require, by the way, that they do go for that test. Yes, you can't do anything more at that point in time. So as you might imagine, Stephen, there's been some abuse, but we don't promote this or advertise it. Just FYI, small business owners, I think most of you understand that. But we want to be really careful because sometimes over promoting things or over advertising things causes it to happen more, right? It makes people aware of rights that they can use. We always want them to use the rights when they need it, but we don't want them to use it frivolously. Lisa chimes back in and says, employee can only claim under the FFCRA once. Correct. That's right. The individual only gets 14 or 2 weeks, basically, of that paid time. So, we've had employees that have had multiple scares. They've used that time up, and then they have another scare. In that situation, they're going to have to be unpaid or use their PTO or sick. So thanks for the questions. The next one, by the way, goes back to a question that was raised earlier. Discrimination claims resulting from the disparate approach to remote work. So here's the thing. This hybrid concept of having some employees work from their homes and some employees work at the physical office. Can we do it? The answer is yes, but you have to have legitimate business distinction as to why you're doing what you're doing. Okay, so positions. An easy example is, my finance department. Everybody can kind of do what they normally do with receivables and payables and balance sheets and all that stuff. They can do that from their house just the same as they can do at the office. But I have police officers, right? And they can't do virtual arrests from their couch. They actually have to be out in the streets. They have to go do those things. So we're going to handle it a little bit different. And the answer is yes, of course. Positionally, we can do that. I would draw up a memo that explains that, of course, to file. But I think that's a good approach. Where we have problems is we have clients that say, well, we want to, Bill is kind of a little lazy. And so he does a fine job as long as I stay on him. So I'm going to have Bill be at the office. But then Dana, who, is top notch, works independently without any supervision, same position, we're going to let her work remotely. Clearly, that's where we run into problems, right? We run into problems when it's the same or similar role and we don't have any documented distinction between them. That's where I think we're going to find ourselves facing some frivolous lawsuits. Sean jumped in and said, do any of the COVID-related accommodations discussed today depend on the organizational size? Yes, so Sean, the EFMLA, so the school-related issue, as we talked about, only, it applies to everybody in theory, but as I mentioned, you can claim an exemption from that if you have under 50 employees, particularly if you're way under 50 employees. We can help you kind of draw that up and say, we're not going to do it. The FFCRA does apply to you, though. The 14-day rule is something all employers are supposed to be abiding by. Another question, if an employee is required to quarantine because of exposure at work, is the employer required to pay for that time once they have used the FFCRA? No. So if somebody is in a forced quarantine, they are eligible for that same 2 weeks of FFCRA, even if they don't have a COVID positive. But once that 14 days, once that 2 weeks has been exhausted, then at that point, you would be under no further obligation to pay them. They would be in unpaid status at that point in time. Thanks, Catherine. Next one says BC still matters, not before Christ, but before COVID. Pay equity under scrutiny. So this is, again, not a COVID-based topic, but it's an important one. In January and February, it became very clear that the EOC, the feds, were going to be filing a lot of lawsuits on gender pay disparity, meaning that men are still paid more than women, about an 83 cents versus $1 indication. So there's a pretty dramatic problem that we still haven't resolved completely. So we saw those kind of issues. More of our clients were requesting that we do pay studies, which we do as a firm, to be sure that men and women are indeed paid comparably. The other big thing is your applications should not be asking about the prior rate of pay that individuals have received in past jobs. Very important on that front as well. So just be mindful. Some of you are, predominantly male, predominantly female, maybe a little less of a concern. But those of you who do have more mixed positions, if you will, make sure there's some legitimate business basis that you're tying it to. 17, I cannot breathe in symbols on masks and t-shirts. So we have urged our clients to go ahead and create, if nothing else, an email or a memorandum to all staff telling them that when they wear masks, the masks should not have logo or text on those masks. Instead, we want them to wear plain or patterned masks are fine. You say, boy, that sounds like very Big Brother. This has been a pretty blah year. Isn't it nice to let them be creative? It is until it's not, so wearing a Florida State mask, although I'm not sure why you might do that right now, right? But I'm teasing, but as a Florida State fan, but that is kind of fun. But what happens is that people are using masks as billboards. And so they're kind of giving you their political or social issues, which again, very powerful, impactful when you're not at work. But what we see is something like, I can't breathe, or vote Trump, or whatever it is. Clearly that creates division, morale problems, et cetera, at work oftentimes. And so what I've told clients is, and people say, well, but Bill, we'll wait till it's controversial, then we'll address it. The problem is, let's say, what you deem to be controversial is I can't breathe. You go and approach that person and they say, you're singling me out because it's race-based, right? Or because of my race. That's a problem, and that's going to be an ugly lawsuit. So it's much better just to get in front of it and say, you know what, we're not doing that. We're just going to go plain masks. That would be my strong recommendation as your employment lawyer, okay? 18, 'tis the season, Biden versus Trump. What more do I need to say? So if you're a private sector employer, public sector employers, which we represent a lot of you as well, but most of you are private sector who are on the line today, you have almost complete control as to how you govern the issue of politics at work. So you can prohibit people from talking about politics. At the very least, you may want to have a conversation that we don't want to come in with inflammatory comments and thoughts. Where does it kind of cross the line for me? It's one thing for my employee to come in and talk about how they really believe in, I don't know, Joe Biden's tax plan or whatever, okay? I'm probably not going to say a whole lot about that versus somebody coming in and sort of saying, oh my gosh, you know, Trump is Satan incarnate and we hate him and da 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 da. Like, as soon as we start attacking the other side in work, that's where it crosses the line for me. So everybody has to kind of strike that balance, but it is a good conversation to be having with folks right now in advance of things blowing up, because it's going to get uglier and uglier as we approach November. Reestablishing job expectations, departmental memos, and 90-day individualized goals. Really great strategy. You have a lot of people who are coming back from work that like the creature comforts of their home, maybe weren't working at quite the same intensity as they used to when they're at the physical workspace. And then you have supervisors and leaders that have never left and they're really tired and exhausted this year. Their patience level is like this. You bring those two groups together and boom, it tends to explode. So with that in mind, you know, a lot of our clients are, when they bring people back on board, they're sort of resetting the tempo by using sort of like, here are the expectations for the 60 days, the 90 days. They're not write-ups or evaluations, but they're just sort of like this formal way of bringing people back to where we need them to be, okay? Really good tool, can be very helpful. And then finally, and we'll wrap up, number 20, email it now. So if you've been to some of my workshops or you're a client, you've been through some of my trainings, you remember that I've always said that when you make the termination decision, you record it in the moment. And you record it by sending an email to somebody else because that gives you a time and date stamp. And you do that even when you're going to delay the announcement, especially when you're going to delay the announcement of the termination decision. Why is that? Well, it's particularly important this year in COVID because I decide that I'm firing Dana, but I have to wait 2 weeks because I have a big conference coming up and I need her help in that, right? If I wait, right, what happens is I get a call from Dana's husband who says, oh, by the way, Dana's in the hospital now with COVID on Friday. Do you think that next week I can go ahead and terminate her? Or I can, but what am I going to face? Well, it's going to look like retaliation, right? It's going to look like that I'm acting because of a medical condition. That's a real problem, except for the fact that I was smart and I sent the email far before she was found to have COVID. That frees me up to carry through with the decision that I need to make. So it's one of those forgotten tools or forgotten sort of disciplines, I guess. That is a whole lot of COVID in the HR employment law in an hour. We're right at 9:30. Lots of great questions that were asked. I hope that I've been able to answer all of them for you. I do want to encourage anybody who's interested in more specific things that relative to your culture to reach out to us. If there's something I mentioned today that you want to talk about more, please feel free to give us a call and we'll go from there. But thank you again to the Chamber. We were talking before we came online of, you know, we do one day at a time, right? And that old mantra, this too shall pass, is what we hold on to. But we're here for you as a community resource when you need us. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you everyone for joining. Again, we have recorded today's session. So once we can export that out and download it, we'll upload it to our YouTube channel and I will get it out to everyone who was registered today. And it'll also live again on our YouTube site for you guys to reference. We thank you for attending. If you are not a Chamber member and you want to learn more, please reach out. Corey Melton in our membership department would be happy to talk to you or myself. You can get in touch with us by visiting our website. And again, this is the first of 4 sessions that we're doing underneath our business recovery series. And so next week or 2 weeks from now, we will do finance and accounting with Andrew Gay and Katie Lilly. And then we will have marketing communications and end with strategic planning. So go register for those. They're free to everyone. And we hope that you guys have a great Thursday and a great rest of your week. Thanks for joining. We'll talk to you soon.